Not every cry finds the wind, but every sound finds a listener. That night in Ravenwood, it wasn't the world that heard. It was a dog. Winter had gripped the mountain town in its icy fist, freezing the river stiff and weighing down the timber bridge with silence so thick it seemed alive. Families slept behind their warm walls, unaware that beneath the old bridge 2 fragile lives were fading into the dark. But one K9, Valor, stirred. Sitting tall in the passenger seat of a lone patrol SUV, his amber eyes cut into the night, his ears twitching. A sharp instinct burned through him, the kind only loyalty could teach. Somewhere down there, hidden under frost and shadow, something called to him. No one else heard the muffled cries wrapped in a blanket the color of midnight, marked by a single square of red. But Valor did, and where he led his handler that night would carve a story Ravenwood would never forget. 2 abandoned infants, 1 haunted officer, and a dog that refused to let love die. This isn't just a rescue. It's about choosing family when the world tries to take it away. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because what you're about to witness may just change how you see loyalty forever. The night pressed heavy over Ravenwood, Montana, a small town tucked into the shoulders of the mountains. That winter was crueler than most, smothering every sound beneath blankets of snow, freezing even the bravest rivers into silence. The sky was veiled, the stars no more than faint scratches of light, while the moon spilled only a dull wash of silver across the frozen ground and the stiff river beneath the old timber bridge. Officer Ethan Cole guided his SUV slowly down the winding road, tires whispering over frost. The heater rattled weakly, but still his breath fogged in the cabin air. In his late 30s, tall and wiry from years of steady police work, Ethan wore grief like a second skin. Hollow shadows clung beneath his gray-blue eyes, silver threaded through his cropped dark hair. Behind the uniform and badge lay something no one else could see. A wound that time had not healed, an ache carved by the memory of his daughter, stolen too soon by a failing heart. Beside him sat Valor, his partner, a black and tan German shepherd built like a shadow of strength. Winter fur thick, gaze steady, he was trained for duty but lived for loyalty. To Ethan, Valor wasn't just a K9, he was an anchor, the steady heartbeat that reminded him life could still move forward. Together, they patrolled Ravenwood's forgotten places. Empty mills, wind-swept alleys, frost-bitten bridges. Tonight, the road pulled them toward one of the town's oldest scars, the timber bridge stretching across the frozen river. That bridge was a relic, groaning under its age. Its planks creaked, its bolts rusted. Graffiti faded into ghostly scrawls. Few lingered there anymore, save for hunters, wanderers, or tonight, 2 tiny souls left in the arms of fate. The SUV slowed to a crawl as Ethan guided it over the planks, eyes scanning the pale white spread beyond. It wasn't his gaze that caught it. It was Valor. The shepherd's ears shot up, body stiff, a low rumble shaking his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked quietly, pulling the SUV aside. Before he could stop, Valor barked sharply, lunged toward the door, and whined with urgency. Ethan barely clipped the leash before the dog yanked forward, dragging him into the snow. Boots crunched through drifts. Breath stung his lungs. But Valor surged ahead, nose slicing through the night. The river lay still, its current trapped in frozen glass. Down the embankment Valor darted, barking beneath the hollow bridge. Ethan's flashlight cut across the beams, trembling in his hand. Then his heart froze. There, nestled in a small hollow of ice and mud, lay 2 infants. Tiny, fragile, swaddled in a woolen blanket dark as midnight. Atop the bundle sat a square of red cloth, glaring against the snow like a flare left by trembling hands. Ethan's chest seized, breath caught in his throat. He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees, flashlight shaking. "Oh God," he whispered. The baby's lips were tinged blue, skin pale and marbled. One let out a faint whimper, barely more than air. The other lay quiet, chest rising in shallow jerks. Panic crashed against training, but something older and heavier drove him. Memory. The sterile hum of machines, the cold hand of his daughter slipping away, the helplessness that had nearly broken him. "Not again. Never again. They're alive," he muttered fiercely, forcing the words into the night as if saying it would make it so. He ripped off his heavy coat, wrapping it around the bundle, tucking the red cloth inside like a sacred plea. Breath poured from him in frantic clouds as he gathered the fragile weight against his chest. Valor pressed close, nose nudging the blanket, body warm against Ethan's leg, urging him forward. "Yes, boy," Ethan rasped, staggering upright. "Let's go." Snow slid beneath his boots as he scrambled up the embankment, adrenaline hauling him faster than fear. At the SUV, he flung open the back door, laid the bundle on the seat, and cranked the heater high. His coat was not enough. He grabbed the emergency blanket, wrapping it snug around the babies until only their small faces showed. One stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering, and Ethan's chest clenched with a surge of desperate hope. He jumped into the driver's seat, flicked on the siren. The quiet night shattered, red and blue lights slicing across snowbanks. Valor leapt into the back, curling protectively around the fragile bundle, his body heat becoming their shield. Ethan slammed the accelerator. Tires spun, caught, and the SUV lunged down the empty road toward St. Era Hospital. His jaw locked tight, his mind racing with memories of his daughter's grave, of her final breath. Not this time. "Not tonight! Dispatch!" he barked into the radio, voice steady though his pulse thundered. "This is Cole. I've got 2 infants, 6 months, hypothermic, unresponsive. ETA 5 minutes. Full pediatric response. We're coming in hot." Snow whipped across the windshield, hospital lights glowing faint in the distance. He pressed the siren louder, as if its wail itself could hold the baby's breathing until they reached the doors. The SUV skidded to a stop by the emergency entrance. Ethan tore the bundle against his chest and ran through the sliding doors, boots hammering against tile, voice breaking through the sterile air. 2 infants! Severe hypothermia. Need immediate care. Nurses surged forward, monitors wheeling. Gloved hands gently pulled the babies from his arms. His chest felt suddenly hollow, but Valor brushed against his leg, steadying him in the chaos. As doctors swept the twins down the corridor, Ethan staggered forward, heart pounding, until a firm hand pressed against his chest. A woman's voice, calm yet commanding, cut through his panic. "Let us work." Dr. Grace Whitaker stood before him, slender in her long white coat, her eyes steady, sea gray, sharp, but kind. In her early 40s, chestnut hair pinned back, her face carried lines etched by sleepless nights and the weight of years spent fighting for fragile lives. Her gaze stopped his protest before it formed. Without another word, she turned and strode into the ward, her voice rising firm and decisive. Baby 1, shallow breaths, oxygen mask. Baby 2, warming blankets, thermal packs under arms and groin. Let's move. Nurses moved in swift tides around her, drawers snapping open, heat lamps flicking on, incubators rolled forward. The twins lay on separate warming tables, swallowed by blankets, tiny forms fighting against the cold. Grace bent close, stethoscope pressed against each chest, her voice calm but urgent. "Weak," she murmured. Then louder, but present. 20 joules on standby in case we lose the rhythm. Keep monitoring. The beeps of the monitors came uncertainly at first, skipping, uneven as though the machines themselves feared the outcome. Grace adjusted the oxygen flow, her gaze locked on the fragile chest that rose and fell with terrifying hesitation. Outside the room, Ethan stood frozen at the observation window. Valor pressed close against his leg. His breath fogged the glass as he watched strangers surround the 2 children he had plucked from death's edge. His chest rose and fell too quickly, memory tightening his throat. He saw not just these twins, but the faint outline of his daughter, pale and motionless, slipping away despite every machine that had beeped her name. He clenched his fists, knuckles whitening, and whispered hoarsely to Valor, "They're not going to die." Note again. The dog pressed his muzzle against Ethan's thigh, a warm weight in the sterile chill of the corridor. Inside, Grace bent close to the first twin. The infant's lips were blue, skin-mottled. She rubbed the tiny chest with firm, steady strokes. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured, voice low, coaxing. "You've made it this far. Breathe with me." The nurse at her side glanced at the monitor. "Still shallow, doctor." O2 sat 42. Up the flow by V, Grace's voice was clipped, precise. Minutes dragged into hours. The children's bodies resisted warmth, resisted air, fought to stay in the gray limbo between silence and life. Grace's back ached, but she refused to straighten. She remembered another night years ago when she had knelt by the side of a hospital bed, not as a doctor, but as a wife. Her husband's hand had slipped from hers after a drunk driver left him broken on the road. She had sworn never to feel that helpless again. And now, staring at these children, she felt a sharp echo of that loss, but also a stubborn spark. Not tonight. Not these ones. Heart rate climbing, a nurse announced suddenly. 78, 90, 105. Grace's chest eased. For the first time in hours, she looked at the monitor. The first baby's oxygen saturation rose like a slow sunrise. 4565. "Good girl," Grace whispered, stroking the baby's cheek. Across the room, the second infant stirred, a weak cry slipping past blue lips. The sound was thin, but it split the air like a victory. Nurses exchanged fleeting smiles before returning to their tasks with doubled determination. By dawn, the twins lay bundled in warmed blankets inside portable cribs. Their color better, their breathing steadier. Grace stood over them, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but eyes softened by something close to wonder. "They'll need monitoring," she told her team voice, "but they're out of immediate danger." The nurses exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for hours. Grace stepped out into the corridor, peeling off her gloves. Ethan straightened at once, searching her face. His uniform was disheveled, his hair damp with sweat, his eyes bloodshot from the weight of old memories and the long night. Valor lifted his head expectantly. "They're alive," Grace said simply. Ethan sagged against the wall, running a hand across his face. His breath left him in a shaky rush, and for the first time since the bridge, he allowed himself to believe. Valor let out a low whine, pressing his body against Ethan as though sharing the relief. "Thank you," Ethan rasped. "God, thank you." "They'll need care," Grace replied gently. "But they're fighters." "Stronger than they look," her gaze softened. "So are you, Officer Cole." Ethan didn't reply. His throat tightened, words catching somewhere between grief and gratitude. He slid down the wall to sit on the hard plastic bench. Valor settling at his boots, eyes fixed on the double doors where the infants now slept. Grace turned back toward the ward, but something within her shifted. It had been years since she allowed herself to feel the stirrings of family, of belonging. These two little girls, fragile and trembling, had opened something she thought she had buried with her husband. She found herself lingering by their cribs after the team dispersed, adjusting their blankets, smoothing wisps of soft hair with fingers that trembled despite her experience. Later, when her shift ended, she did not go home immediately. Instead, she sat in a rocking chair beside the cribs, cradling one baby against her chest, while the other slept within arm's reach. She hummed a lullaby she had not sung in years, a melody she once saved for nights when her husband returned late from work. The child stirred against her shoulder, a tiny sigh escaping, and Grace closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she felt a piece of her broken world knit back together. These children were not hers, not by blood, but in their fragile breaths and quiet weight. She discovered the faintest pulse of a family she thought she could never hold again. Morning light broke over Ravenwood in a pale wash of gold, though the mountains held onto their shadows, keeping the valley wrapped in winter's grip. The snowfall from the night before had slowed to a soft dusting, antiseptic quiet that covered everything in a clean white shroud. Yet beneath that surface lay traces waiting to be found. Traces of the truth Ethan Cole was determined to uncover. At St. Elia Hospital, the two infants rested in warmed cribs, their breathing steadier now, though still fragile. Nurses moved quietly around them, checking monitors, recording vitals, adjusting blankets. In the nursery window, Ethan stood silently with Valor at his side. The German shepherd's ears twitched at each sound, but his amber eyes remained fixed on the cribs. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched the tiny figures stir under their blankets. He had begun calling them Hope and Faith. Temporary names, he told himself, until the mother could be found. But even as he said it, he knew names carried power. They made the children real in a way numbers and reports could not. They carried identity, dignity, belonging. And in a town where abandonment and silence had been laid over them like snow, they needed those things more than anything. Still questions noted at him. Who had left them there? And why in that way, with a blanket of dark wool and a square of red cloth, more signal than concealment? Somewhere out there a mother was either desperate or coerced or both. He could not let the trail grow cold. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the bridge with Valor. The sun sat low, shadows stretching long across the frozen riverbed. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he retraced the path down to the embankment. Valor surged ahead, nose close to the ground, body taut with purpose. The prints were faint, softened by drifting snow, but they were there. Ethan crouched, brushing aside a thin layer of frost. A small, narrow tread, too light to belong to a man's boot. A woman's shoe pressed hurriedly into the snow. "Good boy," Ethan murmured as Valor wed softly, circling the area. The dog pawed at another patch of ground where heavier tracks cut across the powder. Ethan straightened, following the line with narrowed eyes. These were broader, deeper, the tracks of a truck, tires wide and worn, the sort used to navigate rough roads. They led away from the bridge east toward the fringes of town where abandoned mills and shuttered houses stood. The thought sharpened Ethan's suspicion. This wasn't the desperate act of someone discarding children in secret. It was the act of someone who needed them found but couldn't be the one to bring them forward. And if there had been a truck nearby, then someone else had been involved. He snapped photographs of the prints with his phone, careful to mark the direction with a small branch. Valor sniffed further up the trail, then barked once, sharp, as if to confirm what Ethan already knew. There was more to this than chance. Back at the station, the warmth of the wood-paneled building did little to ease the tension that simmered beneath its roof. Files and reports lay scattered across the desk in the small office where Sheriff Randall Briggs leaned back in his chair. Randall was in his late 50s with thinning, blonde hair combed meticulously over a widening bald spot, his stomach pressing against a belt polished too often. His uniform was neat, creases sharp, but his eyes held the weary shrewdness of a man more concerned with appearances than substance. Ethan stood opposite him, jaw tight. He laid the photographs on the desk with deliberate force. There are tracks out there, woman's shoes, truck tires leading toward the East Ridge. We can't just ignore this. Randall glanced at the photos, barely leaning forward. Hessiged, tapping his pen against a file. Ethan, I know you've got a good heart, but you're chasing shadows. 2 kids left under a bridge. Tragic, sure, but people abandon children all the time in worse ways. It doesn't mean we have to spin this into some grand conspiracy. Ethan's eyes flared. Abandonment doesn't explain the red cloth. It doesn't explain why they were left where I patrol. Almost as if it was planned. Someone wanted them found, Randall. That's not random. That's a cry for help. Randall's mouth tightened. And if it was, then whoever left them succeeded. They're alive. The hospital is them. Let social services take it from here. We don't need to dig into half-baked theories and drag this department through the mud. Valor let out a low growl as though echoing Ethan's frustration. Ethan leaned across the desk, voice hard. You're not listening. There's a mother out there, scared, maybe hurt, maybe running from something worse. If we shut this down now, we're condemning her as well as those kids. Randall slapped the pen down, his face weening. What I'm not going to do is waste manpower on a ghost chase when we've got real cases piling up. Themayor already thinks this department overspends. If you want to play savior, do it on your own time. But as far as official channels go, this case is closed. The words struck like a gavel. Ethan clenched his fists, his pulse pounding. For a moment, he considered pushing further, raising his voice, calling out Randall's cowardice in front of the deputies outside, but he swallowed the urge. Not here, not yet. Instead, he gathered the photographs, sliding them back into his pocket. Fine, he said tightly. On your record, this case is closed. On mine, it's just beginning. Randall smirked faintly, though unease flickered in his eyes. He shifted back in his chair, pretending indifference. Do what you want, Cole. Just don't drag the rest of us down with you. Ethan turned sharply on his heel, Valor trotting close behind. As the office door swung shut, the low murmur of voices in the station hushed for a moment. The deputies had heard the exchange. Tension hung in the air, thick as smoke. The divide had been drawn, and Ethan knew it would not fade easily. Outside, snow fell again in soft flakes, dusting the town in white silence. Ethan stood on the steps of the station, drawing in the cold air until it burned his lungs. Valor pressed close, nudging his hand with a wet nose. Ethan exhaled slowly, lowering his gaze to the dog. They think it's over, he murmured. But we know better, don't we, boy? Those tracks, those prints, they're a trail, and we're going to follow it no matter who tries to stop us. Valor's tail flicked once, his body taut with readiness. Together they stepped into the snow, leaving behind the warmth of the station and the weight of authority that no longer guided Ethan's conscience. The truth lay out there beneath the endless drifts waiting to be uncovered, and he would not let it remain buried. The wind had risen again, over Ravenwood, sweeping across the valley with the shrill cry of a predator circling unseen. Snow chased itself across the frozen ground in restless swirls, and the skeletal silhouettes of trees leaned into the gale like weary travelers. Ethan Cole tightened his scarf against his throat and adjusted the leash clipped to Valor's collar. The German shepherd pulled with unusual urgency, nose low to the ground, his every movement sharpened by instinct. Ethan trusted Valor's senses more than most men's words. The tracks from the previous day had faded, but Valor was relentless. He pulled east of the bridge, paws striking clean prints into the snow until they crested a rise. At the foot of the hill stood a cabin, leaning against the woods as though it had been abandoned by time itself. The structure was small, built of rough-hewn logs gone gray with age. Its roof sagged beneath snowdrifts, a broken shutter banged rhythmically in the wind, and frost had crawled across the single window like veins. Ethan slowed, resting his hand near the holster on his belt, scanning the surroundings. Valor growled low, ears pry-cricked. Inside, the air was thick with the stale scent of wood smoke and mildew. The door creaked on rusted hinges as Ethan stepped in, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The place bore the unmistakable marks of recent habitation. A half-burned log in the fireplace, an empty tin of beans tossed in the corner, a blanket spread unevenly on the floor. Then he saw it, an old wool coat draped over the back of a chair. He lifted it, and the flashlight revealed faint stains near the collar. Small rings of dried milk, baby milk. Ethan's pulse quickened. He pressed the fabric to his nose. The faint sweetness lingered beneath the musk of damp wool. On the table nearby lay a piece of paper, folded and creased as though handled again and again. He smoothed it open with gloved hands. The words scrolled in hurried strokes spilled desperation. My name is Marina Hayes. If you find this, I have no choice. They are watching me. They took everything. My babies were not safe with me. I left them near the bridge because I knew someone would pass. Someone who might save them. I could not let the men find them. Forgive me. The writing wavered, blotched in places where tears had fallen. At the bottom, a final line. They forced me to move packages. If I refuse, they threaten worse. Please, if there is mercy left in this world, keep them safe. Ethan lowered the page slowly, jaw tightening. The name Marina Hayes anchored the faceless shadow he'd been chasing. She wasn't a phantom nor a careless mother. She was a woman cornered, driven into a cage by predators who hid in plain sight. Valor sat at his side, amber eyes watching him intently, tail motionless against the dusty floor. Ethan crouched, scratching behind the dog's ears. She wanted them found, boy. She trusted someone would care enough to notice. His voice cracked, rough with the weight of memory and resolve. He slipped the letter into an evidence bag and folded the coat over his arm. The walls of the cabin creaked in the wind like a whisper urging Hymanward. He knew now what he was facing. Not abandonment, but entrapment, and Marina was still out there. Back in town, St. Alara Hospital buzzed with quieter rhythms. The storm had eased, leaving behind a fragile peace. Inside the pediatric wing, Grace Whitaker moved softly from crib to crib, her white coat swaying with each step. She had just finished a long shift, hair pulled into loose ponytail, dark circles beneath her gray-green eyes, yet her presence carried warmth like a hearth. Hope and Faith, as Ethan had named them, lay nestled in new blankets she had purchased herself. One had a faint blush returning to her cheeks. The other clutched a small knitted toy Grace had brought in from home. She adjusted theirs waddles gently, humming under her breath. The same tune she once sang in the quiet of her living room before everything shattered. Grace had lost her husband 3 winters ago. A car accident on black ice had stolen him away without warning, leaving her to navigate an empty house filled with unspoken dreams. Since then, she had lived for her work, pouring herself into each small patient as though each heartbeat could erase the silence left behind. But as she watched the twins stir and stretch, she felt something different. A tether, fragile but real, drawing her back toward a life she thought she'd buried. When a nurse peeked into the ward, she smiled knowingly. "Doctor, you'll spoil them." Grace laughed softly, though her eyes shimmered. Maybe they deserve to be spoiled for once. She brought bottles of formula she had purchased herself, feeding each child carefully. Their tiny hands curled around her fingers, and she pressed kisses to their foreheads as naturally as if they had always been hers. Around the hospital, whispers began to circle. Grace Whitaker, the doctor with no children of her own, had become the twins' guardian angel. Later that evening, she settled into the rocking chair by their cribs, a knitted shawl over her shoulders. The steady creak of wood and the warmth of the infants against her chest dulled the ache that had lived inside her for years. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to imagine. Imagine a home not empty, laughter echoing against the walls, and the possibility of family blooming in the unlikeliest season. Back across town, Ethan stood by the window of his patrol SUV, the letter from Marina lying open on the dashboard. Snow flurries drifted past the glass as Valor sat patiently in the back, his gaze unwavering. Ethan tapped the paper with a glove finger. Marina's words etched themselves into him like a brand. She hadn't abandoned her children. She'd trusted strangers because she had no other choice, and now it fell to him to ensure that trust wasn't betrayed. As the wind pressed against the SUV, Ethan whispered into the quiet, "I'll find you, Marina. You won't be alone anymore." Valor's ears twitched, his amber eyes steady in the mirror. Outside, Ravenwood lay hushed beneath the snow. But somewhere in its shadows, Marina Hayes was waiting, and Ethan Cole, with his loyal dog at his side, would not rest until her story was no longer written in fear. The snow in Ravenwood had a way of covering tracks, but never erasing them entirely. For Ethan Cole, every flake seemed a whisper of secrets buried only inches deep. Marina Hayes was no longer a faceless name scratched onto paper. Her letter had drawn her in flesh and spirit, a woman trapped in chains she could not break. Ethan knew he had to follow the threads back to their beginning if he was ever to untangle her fate. He started at the old textile mill on the edge of town, a building that had once roared with machinery and the chatter of workers, but now stood silent, its windows broken and walls scarred by graffiti. Ethan had known men and women who lost their livelihoods when the mill shuttered 3 years earlier. Marina had been among them. Inside, the air was musty with damp wood and rust. Rusted spools of thread lay scattered across the floor, rats having chewed through the remnants of fabric that still clung to the machinery. Ethan's flashlight beam swept across the abandoned floor until it caught a faded notice pinned to a corkboard. A list of employees, Marina Hayes' name circled in red. She worked here, Ethan murmured more to Valor than himself. The shepherd stood beside him, tail still, ears forward. Neighbors in Ravenwood remembered Marina as a quiet woman in her late 20s. With long auburn hair she usually tied back in a braid. Eyes that carried a gentleness touched by worry. She had raised the twins on her own after her partner vanished from town. Too restless or too cowardly to stay, she kept to herself walking to work and later struggling to keep food on the table after the mill's collapse. It was after the mill closed that Dean Kessler appeared. Kessler, once a logistics officer in the National Guard, had returned to Ravenwood with scars across his jaw and an eye for opportunity. He was broad-shouldered with steel gray hair cropped short and a gaze that unnerved even seasoned officers. People said he spoke little, but carried the weight of authority in every word. He built a network in the shadows, exploiting the desperation of those left jobless. He moved goods, stolen electronics, counterfeit pills, eventually drugs, through the mountain passes, paying locals to keep quiet or look away. When Marina refused his affair to run packages through town, Kessler turned his sights darker. First came threats slipped under her door, then menacing figures trailing her home. She tried to resist, but resistance in Ravenwood came with a price. Ethan pieced these stories together like shards of broken glass, each cutting sharper than the last. He visited the market where vendors still remembered seeing Marina on bitter nights, slipping between stalls to leave behind small parcels, baby food, secondhand clothes, even jars of fruit preserves. She never lingered. She never spoke. She only looked over her shoulder, eyes wide, as though someone might strike her down for daring to show care. One vendor, an elderly woman named Hattie O'Connor, leaned on her cane as she spoke to Ethan. That girl loved those babies. She'd leave things when she thought no one was watching. I tried to speak to her once, but she bolted. Like a deer spooked by a hunter, Ethan thanked her, though his jaw was clenched tight. Marina was a mother living in terror, still fighting to provide for her children, even when they had been torn from her arms. That truth burned through him like fire, but fire could not be kindled in a vacuum. In the office of Sheriff Randall Briggs, shadows moved differently. Randall sat behind his desk, his uniform neat as always, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He was meeting with a visitor whose presence would have startled Ethan had he been there. Dean Kessler sat in the chair opposite, legs spread, hands folded, loosely over his lap. His jawline scar caught the glow of Randall's desk lamp and his eyes glinted like ice. "You'll keep your men out of my business," Kessler said evenly, voice low but sharp. "That boy Cole is getting restless." Randall lifted his coffee, sipping slowly. "Cole's always been restless. He thinks every mystery hides a ghost. I'll keep him in line." Kessler leaned forward. "For your sake, you better. You like your pension, don't you? You like your town to stay quiet? Let him keep poking and something loud might happen. Something neither of us wants." Randall exhaled through his nose heavy and slow before nodding. His belly pressed against the desk as he scribbled on a notepad. "I'll delay his reports. Shuffle the paperwork. Let the winter bury his trail." But not everyone in the station was blind. Deputy Nora Bennett, 26 years old, had joined the force fresh out of the academy. Her uniform crisp, her brown hair usually pulled into a tight ponytail. She was ambitious, sharp-eyed, with a streak of stubbornness that had already earned her warnings from Randall for insubordination. That night, as she sorted through case logs at her desk, she noticed discrepancies. Reports filed late, patrol records altered. Ethan's findings about Marina and the tire tracks tucked into folders marked pending and quietly shelled. She leaned back, eyes narrowing. Randall's neat script stood out on the margins, shifting dates and removing names. Nora's stomach turned. She had grown up in Ravenwood, daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher. She had joined the force because she believed in keeping her town honest. Seeing Randall's fingerprints on deception made her blood run hot. She closed the file slowly, glancing toward Randall's closed office door. His voice carried faintly through the wood, low and conspiratorial. She could not yet hear the name Kessler, but she felt it in her bones. Nora decided then and there. She would not confront Randall head-on. She would watch. She would document. She would dig quietly until the truth cracked open, no matter how much it cost her career. Back at the market, Ethan watched Valor sniff at a lamppost where Marina's scent still lingered faintly. Snow fell and soft flakes around them, catching in the shepherd's fur. Ethan clenched his fists, staring at the alley where she must have vanished into the night. "You're still here," he whispered to the dark. "You're still fighting, and I'll find you, Marina." Before they do, Valor lifted his head, ears pricked, and barked once into the emptiness. The sound echoed down the frozen street, defiant, a promise cast against Thesalence. The tracks that Valor had followed cut through the crust of snow-like scars. Ethan's boots sank with each step as he pushed forward, his breath steaming in the brittle night air. The dog was relentless, nose lowered, muscles taut, pulling him toward the edge of Ravenwood, where the old railway line threaded across the valley. There, tucked behind a row of skeletal pines, stood a warehouse long since abandoned. Its corrugated steel walls rusted, its windows patched with boards. The place loomed against the snow, eerie and silent. But for the groan of wind pressing through cracks, Ethan slowed, hand-brushing the butt of his holstered sidearm, every sense sharpened. Valor gave a low growl, the kind that promised more than warning. He slipped closer, crouching near a window smeared with frost. Inside, a single light bulb flickered from a chain. Shadows moved, 2 men pacing near crates, rifles slung over their shoulders and against a wall. Slumped on a wooden chair with wristbound was Marina Hayes. Even through the grime-streaked pain, Ethan recognized her from the fragments of description he'd gathered. Auburn hair now tangled, falling loose across her shoulders, a face pale with exhaustion, but still carrying a quiet dignity. Her eyes in green, shadowed by fear, flicked toward every sound inside the warehouse, like a deer trapped between hunters. "Hang on," Ethan whispered, his breath frosting against the glass. He circled to the side door, Valor padding silently beside him. Inside, the cold air cut like knives. The stench of oil and damp wood filled his nostrils as he moved from shadow to shadow. One guard turned, muttering to the other, and Ethan seized the moment. He whistled low. Valor lunged forward, a streak of muscle and teeth slamming into the man's arm. The rifle clattered to the ground as the thug howled, pinned beneath the dog's weight. The second man swung his weapon, but Ethan charged, shoulder crashing into him. The impact sent them sprawling across the concrete. They grappled, fists striking, boots scraping against spilled grain. Ethan landed a punch squarely against the man's jaw, knocking him unconscious against the crate. "Cole," the voice boomed from deeper inside, commanding, "Cold." Dean Kessler stepped from the shadows. His broad frame filled the narrow aisle, scar across his jaw catching the light. He carried himself with the palm of someone used to control, his pistol held steady in his hand. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" His tone was measured, almost conversational. Ethan rose slowly, gun drawn, muscles strung tight. "Let her go, Kessler." It's over. Kessler's mouth curved into something like a smile. "You think snapping a few pictures of tracks in the snow makes you untouchable. This town runs because men like me make sure it runs." Your sheriff knew that Ethan's jaw tightened. "Randall's finished. You'll be next." At that, Marina stirred in her chair, her voice trembling but clear. "He's telling the truth. Randall's on their payroll." "Dean, please don't make this worse." Kessler's eyes flickered toward her, but the smile never faltered. "Worse? No, Marina. Worse is starving. Worse is watching your children freeze without a roof. I gave you a way out and you spat in my face." Tears shone on her cheeks. "You wanted me to risk their lives. I couldn't." The standoff stretched taut as steel cable. Ethan's finger tightened against his trigger. Valor snarled, still holding the downed thug beneath his paws. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Kessler raised his pistol, but Ethan was faster. A sharp crack split the air. Kessler staggered, the gun flying from his grip as Ethan's shot struck the weapon clean from his hand. He cried out, clutching his wrist, the scarred jaw twisting in pain and rage. Valor released the thug and bounded forward, knocking Kessler hard against a stack of crates. Ethan closed in, slamming cuffs around his wrists. The clang of steel echoed like final judgment. Marina sobbed as Ethan cut the ropes from her wrists. She collapsed forward, clutching her freed hands against her chest. Up close, Ethan saw the toll. Bruises ringed her arms, lips chapped, skin too pale from nights in the cold. But her spirit, fragile though it was, remained unbroken. "They're alive," Ethan told her quietly, steadying her shoulders. "Your daughters are safe. They're at the hospital." Her eyes widened, tears spilling anew. "Hope, faith." She choked on the names, though she had never spoken them before. "Thank God." Outside, sirens wailed as backup units arrived, Nora Bennett among them. She strode into the warehouse with her service weapon drawn, her ponytail escaping its neat bind after the rush. At 26, she still had the unjaded fire that many in the department had lost. Her brown eyes swept the scene, taking in Kessler in cuffs, the unconscious thugs, and Marina trembling by Ethan's side. "You did it," Nora said, lowering her gun, though her voice trembled with relief. Ethan shook his head. "Valor did most of it." The shepherd pressed against his leg, chest heaving from the fight, but eyes steady. Nora turned her attention to Kessler, her lip curling. The sheriff won't be able to bury this. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a flash drive, small and unassuming. I've been tracking his backroom deals for months. Phone records, bank transfers. Randall's finished. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing off his shoulders. Then maybe Ravenwood can finally breathe. As Randall was placed in temporary suspension later that night, the truth spread quickly through the ranks. Deputies whispered in the halls, some in disbelief, others with grim recognition. The revelation that their sheriff had been pocketing blood money stained the department's pride, but Nora's evidence was irrefutable. Back at the hospital, Grace cradled hope while a nurse tended to Faith. The baby stirred restlessly, but warmth and nourishment were finally steady in their lives. Grace rocked gently, her gray-green eyes glistening. She had begun to feel less like a doctor and more like something else. A guardian, perhaps even a mother. When Ethan finally returned Marina, leaning heavily against him, Grace rose to meet them, their eyes locked. Doctor, officer, mother. 3 lives bound together by 2 fragile children who had survived the snow. Outside the hospital, Ravenwood streets lay quiet under a new fall of snow. But for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the cold less keenly. Justice had not yet been fully delivered, but the first blow had been struck, and the fragile thread of hope, woven in frost and fire, held fast. The courthouse of Ravenwood stood tall against the winter sky, its stone facade stir with age but dignified. A sentinel of law and order. On that morning, its steps were crowded, reporters huddled under scarves, their breaths steaming as they adjusted cameras. Residents of the small mountain town gathered, whispering among themselves, waiting for justice that had been too long delayed. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut, thick with anticipation. Dean Kessler sat at the defense table, his broad shoulders squared, jaw scar rigid beneath the cold glare of the overhead lights. His once commanding presence seemed diminished in shackles, yet his eyes still held a glint of defiance. His men, 3 in total, sat behind him, their heads bowed, faces pale. The judge presiding over the case was Eleanor Stroud, a woman in her late 50s with a stern but steady presence. She wore her black robe-like armor, her silver-streaked hair tied back neatly, her hazel eyes sharp. Known for her fairness and an unshakable commitment to truth, Judge Stroud was not one to yield to intimidation. The trial had been swift but thorough. Evidence of Kessler's smuggling network, including ledgers, testimonies, and the damning letter from Marina Hayes, painted a picture of coercion and cruelty. Witnesses described how Kessler had built an empire of fear, exploiting the desperate and silencing dissent. Most damning of all were photographs of the 2 infants bundled beneath the bridge, their survival hanging by a thread. Marina testified with trembling hands but unwavering voice. She recounted how Kessler had cornered her after the mill closed, how he forced her to transport packages and threatened her children. Her auburn hair was neatly brushed, her pale skin still recovering from weeks of stress. But her green eyes shone with newfound resolve. Each word weighed heavy in the courtroom, silencing Yvonne, the reporter, scribbling notes. When the verdict came, it struck like a bell. Dean Kessler, Judge Stroud declared, her voice clear as steel. For the crimes of smuggling, coercion, kidnapping, and endangerment of minors, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, the courtroom murmured. A ripple of relief and anger mingled. Kessler's jaw clenched, but his shoulders slumped at last, the fight gone. His men were given sentences of 10 to 15 years, each pale and broken as the gavel struck. Then came the turn of Randall Briggs. The former sheriff stood stiffly, his uniform replaced by a plain suit that did little to disguise his fall from grace. His thinning blonde hair was disheveled, his face ruddy, his eyes darting nervously. For the crimes of obstruction of justice, bribery, and dereliction of duty, Judge Stroud said firmly, you are sentenced to 7 years in state prison. Randall lowered his head, the weight of shame heavier than the sentence itself. Nora Bennett, seated quietly in the gallery, felt a grim satisfaction. She had risked her career to expose him, but today proved it had been worth it. When the proceedings ended, Marina stepped into the crisp winter air, flanked by Ethan and Grace. Hope and Faith, bundled in matching wool coats, clung to their mother's arms. The crowd that had gathered outside parted, then applauded, a wave of warmth breaking against the chill. Marina wept openly, pressing kisses to her daughter's foreheads, whispering promises of a new beginning. Ethan stood beside her, shoulders straight, eyes steady. For years, he had lived with a hollow echo of loss, his daughter's absence a wound that refused to close. Yet, as he watched Marina cradle her children, as valor pressed close against his leg, he felt something shift. Family was not always what you lost, Sometimes it was what you chose to protect, to build anew. Grace was radiant in her quiet way, her gray-green eyes glimmering with pride. She had found her purpose again, not just in healing bodies, but in nurturing futures. The hospital whispered of her devotion to the twins. But today, she thought further. Weeks later, flyers appeared around town. Ravenwood Haven, support for single mothers. Grace had opened the program with hospital sponsorship inspired by Marina's courage. It offered counseling, childcare, and community aid. She spoke passionately at its launch, her voice trembling with conviction. No mother should have to choose between survival and safety for her children. Here you are not alone. Ethan attended the meetings when shifts allowed, sitting quietly at the back with Valor sprawled at his feet. The mothers and children who came to the program learned quickly to trust the shepherd whose amber eyes and calm presence eased fears in ways words never could. Ethan found meaning in the small tasks, fixing chairs, hauling boxes, sometimes just listening. Each moment chipped away at the grief that had long defined him. The season turned, snow softening under the first hint of spring. On a clear afternoon, the townsfolk of Ravenwood gathered in the square for a ceremony. Lanterns hung from wooden posts. Banners fluttered in the breeze. It was a day to honor resilience, to mark a new beginning after shadows had threatened to consume them. At the center of the square, Ethan stood in uniform, Valor at his side, the leash loose but unnecessary. Marina held her daughters close, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. Grace stood beside her, shawl draped over her shoulders, her hand lightly resting on Marina's arm. The three of them, officer, doctor, mother, were bound by more than chance. They were bound by survival, by faith, by love found in unlikely places. The mayor stepped forward, his voice warm with pride. Today we honor not just the victory of justice, but the courage of those who stood against fear. Officer Ethan K9 Valor, your devotion saved lives. Valor, you are hereby awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. Applause erupted as the mayor bent to fasten the medal around the shepherd's thick neck. Valor blinked slowly, tail swishing once, amber eyes calm as though accepting not glory, but acknowledgement of duty. Ethan knelt, pressing a hand to the dog's shoulder, his voice low. Good boy, always the square filled with cheers. Marina lifted hope and faith, their tiny hands waving clumsily. Grace's eyes shimmered as she looked at them. And Ethan, catching her gaze, felt the faintest smile tug his lips. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in more than survival. As the sun dipped low, casting long rays of gold across the mountains, the people of Ravenwood lingered together, voices lifted in laughter and promise. In their midst stood a new family, not by blood alone, but by choice, by devotion, by the unyielding bond of love. And as the shadows stretched long, they carried with them not fear, but light. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not written in the sky with fire or thunder, but whispered into the cold night through the cry of a child, the loyalty of a dog, or the courage of a weary soul who refuses to give up. In Marina's tears, in Ethan's strength, in Grace's compassion, and in Valor's faithfulness, we see what God has always promised us. That light shines brightest when the world is at its darkest. In our own daily lives, we may not face smugglers or stand in courtrooms, but we do face fear, loneliness, and despair. And yet, God still works through ordinary people, through small acts of kindness, through the families we find and the love we share. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories of courage, faith, and hope. May God bless you and keep you.